Now this is thought for the day for the 30th of May on behalf of Larbert Baptist Church. The Gospel of Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, has 2 chapters early on in the Gospel, chapters 5, 6 and 7, of the Saviour preaching what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's the beginning of his ministry. Chapters 23, 24, 25 of the Gospel of Matthew are again the Saviour preaching a sermon. But this is at the end of his ministry. And the tone of this last sermon is different. There's a solemnity, and it's because the Saviour is rejected. And within days, well nigh within hours of his preaching this sermon, he would be betrayed and crucified. And there's a very different atmosphere in these chapters 23, 24, 25. And I've been studying, not by any manner of means for the first time, chapter 24 and verses 4 to 14. The Saviour is dealing with the result of his own rejection. He is the Saviour, and if he is rejected, the outcome is inevitably serious. And in these verses, as indeed in all those chapters, there are 2 emphases. And the first is this, that where there is individualism, that is, the raising up of one's self as the supreme authority in life, the result will be increasing disorder and chaos. And that runs through everything in those chapters. Indeed, it runs through everything that the Saviour spoke of in his ministry. But the other emphasis is this, that despite all of that, God's divine purpose is proceeding. He is designing to save a fallen world. And that purpose is not derailed by any manner of disorder and chaos. And both these emphases are preached by the Saviour with a note of certainty. He speaks with absolute confidence, and he lifts up everything that he is saying to the omniscience of God, that is, God's absolute knowledge, and to the omnipotence of God, that is, God's absolute power, and to the omnipresence of God, that is, God is there in the situation, notwithstanding all the chaos and all the disorder that seems to be all around the situation. And in verses 4 to 14, the Saviour is addressing this matter of the individualism, the assertion of each individual. I am going to do my own thing, over against the saving purpose of God. Inevitably, therefore, there are 9 very solemn and serious emphases in these verses. There will be deception. The Saviour says, many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. There are many frauds around. There will be wars and rumours of wars. Everywhere there will be the notification of conflict. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. A sort of nationalism, assertive and strident and vainglorious and vulgar, will be evident everywhere. The very environment will seem to be against us. Famines, pestilences, earthquakes. There will be hatred against the Saviour's disciples. Not just then, but throughout the whole of the coming time, to what the Saviour 3 times here calls the end, the consummation of God's purpose. There will be hatred of the followers of Christ. You'll be hated, said the Saviour, for my name's sake. There'll be this most especial, concentrated loathing of the name of Christ. Many disciples will be offended, says the Saviour. The word is scandalized. And they'll give up. They'll renege. They will go back on their testimony as servants of Christ. And they will join the world in the world's hatred of the followers of Christ. Lawlessness, said the Saviour, lawlessness will abound. That needs to be explained. It isn't that the world just becomes a sort of wild west. The word lawlessness, anomia, is the Greek word, is a rejection of God's law and a making of the way for whatever any individual thinks he or she should go by. There is this accumulation of difficulties that demands laws against this and laws against that, until one can hardly take a step without somehow infringing some legislation, and all of it because of lawlessness, rejection of God's law, and it will abound. And the love of many, said the Saviour, will grow cold. Oh, they say, I can't cope with this, and they give up. These are the words of Christ as he speaks in this, his last sermon before his betrayal and crucifixion. But then in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 13, the Saviour says, but he who endures to the end will be saved. What the Saviour means is, don't give up, don't give up, don't give up. And why? Well, in verse 14, this is what he says. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Notice, this gospel of the kingdom. This isn't a matter of you being saved, full stop. This is the gospel that affects the whole society of human beings. This is the gospel of the kingdom. This is the answer to the disorder and chaos that is everywhere apparent. This gospel is good news. It's the kingdom of a new society. A society of subjects of the King of Kings, not a random hodgepodge of each individual doing his or her own thing. This is a society, a kingdom, where there is the well-being of the whole society rather than the grubbing, selfish grabbing for cash. This is where each subject of the King of Kings contributes to the common good rather than milking the system. This is the gospel. This gospel. There is no other. It is this gospel. And it is the gospel where a man or a woman finds identity not in self, but in being the subject and servant of the King of Kings. I personally find it a most blessed aspect to our life here that we are subjects of a very gracious Christian Queen, and we are grateful to God. I am grateful to God for her long reign. I am more grateful to God that by the grace of the King of Kings, he has made me a subject of his kingdom. And this indeed is the gospel. Who is on the Lord's side? Who will serve the King? Who will be his helpers, other lives to bring? Who will leave the world's side? Who for him will go? Who is on the Lord's side? Who will face the foe? By thy call of mercy, by thy grace divine, we are on the Lord's side. Saviour,